the Egyptian house and its furniture, food and drink, etc. From the dwellers on the Nile, the life, history, religion, and literature of the ancient Egyptians by E.A. Wallis Budge. The bed of the early period, as well as the bier, was represented by the hieroglyph, somewhat like a lion, somewhat like a sheep. The space between the framework was filled in either with wood or cordwork, as the present day, and on this were laid simple reeds, mats, or cushions. Men and women alike used a pillow or a headrest, which is often buried with them in their tombs. And you see the thing with the, for them to rest their head upon. It lifted up the head of a man when living, and the head of his mummy when dead. The pillow was sometimes made of limestone, and was inscribed with the name of its possessor in hieroglyphs, inlaid with blue or green paste. Pillows of wood were frequently ornamented with ivory inlay, and on the rounded portions, beautifully carved figures of the head of Bes are often found. And, that's the joke-making entity, and be a great political one to do next, wouldn't it? The single upright support is often replaced by folding legs, the ends of which are carved to resemble the heads of geese. These brought to the sleeper the protection of the goose, which, they believed it would protect him, which the Egyptians believed to be a good, ever-wakeful watcher that would warn the sleeper of danger. The Egyptians made amulets in the form of the pillow and buried them with their dead. On these was generally cut a version of chapter 866 of the Book of the Dead. The mats are cushions that survived as mattresses, varied in thicknesses, and it seemed that they were sometimes supplemented by what may be termed a padded quilt, like that of the lahaf, which is found in Egypt today. The sleeper lay on one part of this, and drew the other part over him to serve as bedclothes. Good bedsteads stood high, and footstools were often needed to get on them. The well-to-do provided themselves, as Herodotus says, 295, with network coverings under which to sleep, and these were the equivalents of the modern mosquito nets. These were, of course, unnecessary in hilly districts, but in places near the river and in the delta at certain seasons of the year, sleep would have been impossible without them. Palladius tells the story of a certain ascetic who went to a marshy district in the delta in order to mortify the flesh through the bites of the gnats, the mosquitoes, and when he had been there but a short time, his skin became covered with lumps, and was like the hide of the hippopotamus. The chairs had high, straight backs, decorated with inlaid work, and must have formed very uncomfortable resting places. The seats of some were so high that footstools or cushions were necessary for comfort. The seats were often made of wood, and for these cushions were provided. The seat made of papyrus cords or leather was the most comfortable to sit upon. The armchair with a low back was well known and much used by people of good position. Chairs of state were elaborately carved, inlaid with ivory and ebony, and otherwise decorated, and those that served as thrones for kings were regarded with the same awe and reverence as is the king's stool among modern African peoples. Favorite chairs, stools, cushions, pillows, etc. were often buried in the tombs of their owners, as the collections of furniture from the tombs that are exhibited in the great museums in Europe and America testify. Now, as much as I do not believe in grave goods, it's interesting to think about what survived as a result of such practices. The various kinds of tables used by modern nations were unknown to the Egyptians, and their one table was that from which they ate their food. It consisted of two parts, a round stand about 12 inches high, with projecting ends and a thick, flat, circular slab, which formed the table proper, on which the food was placed. The slab was often covered with a layer of pieces of palm branches, but sometimes the branches were stuck into holes in the slab and stood upright, and so kept away flies. The dish or tray with the food was placed on the slab, and the family and their guests seated themselves round it on stools, and took the food with their fingers. The clothes of the family were kept in wooden chests or in small crates made of thin strips of wood or the stems of palm branches. The former were divided into sections by wooden partitions, and some of them contained small wooden receptacles in which objects of special value could be placed. Jewelry was kept in little square or rectangular coffers, made generally of wood, and their sides and covers were inlaid with ivory, glass plate, plaques of blue and green, Egyptian porcelain, etc. Under the Middle Kingdom, and probably earlier, an official, when traveling about on his duties, carried the necessary changes of apparel in small wickerwork cases, like modern suitcases. These were divided into sections, like those of a dressing case, in which articles for the toilet, etc. were kept. How the Egyptians warmed their houses is not known exactly. Fireplaces, in the modern sense of the word, were unknown to them. In making fire, they used a fire drill. You know, that sound. The mortar and pestle looking thing, which was similar in form to that which has been employed in Africa from time immemorial. The drill itself was a piece of very hard wood, round one end of which several ridges were cut. This was inserted into a hole made in a piece of soft dry wood, and made to revolve rapidly by the two hands between which it was placed, being rubbed quickly each over the other, or by means of a cord. A little inflammable material was placed in the hole to which the borer worked, and this soon burst into flame. There is reason to believe that the Egyptians knew how to strike fire from flints, for fuel, straw of various kinds, and dried cow dung were used, and rarely wood. Nothing in the nature of coal was known to the Egyptians. The houses were lighted by lamps from the earliest times. It is probable that the ordinary lamp was made of stone or earthenware, and was round or shell-shaped, and very shallow, with a projecting lip. Into this a small quantity of castor oil, or some other vegetable oil, was poured, and a few linen threads, laid in the oil, served as a wick. These threads were drawn out over the lip, and lighted, and trimmed from time to time. 40 years ago many such lamps were to be seen in many parts of Egypt and of the Sudan, but they gave very little light, it is true, but they made no smoke. The Egyptians must have used artificial light of some kind in painting the walls and ceilings of the tombs, but nowhere do we find any trace of blackening by lamp smoke, and the only light they can have had was that given by lamps. We may dismiss from consideration the statements that have been made to the effect that the Egyptians used electricity for lighting purposes, for they are wholly unsupported by any evidence. But it is possible, as Herodotus suggests, 262, that the wicks of their lamps were placed in some earthy substance, which was saturated with oil and served as a feeder of them. Judging by the appearance of the objects that have been found in graves of the Old Kingdom and have been identified as lamps, early lamps had no projecting lip, and the wicks were placed in the center. If this be so, the shape of the lamp was that of a small bowl, and the oil-saturated material and the wick resembled a modern nightlight. A lampstand that would accommodate several lamps was found in the Theban tomb, and we know from the inscription on a stela formed at Jabal Barkal that a lampstand was dedicated to the temple of Amun-Ra there, and the lampstand kind of reminds you of a menorah, but it's not 7, it's not 9, it's 5. The lighted or burning lamp played an important part in some of the religious and magical ceremonies of the Egyptians, as may be seen from the Vinay of chapter 137 of the Book of the Dead. The Egyptian Christians, i.e. the Copts, made their lamps of bronze and earthenware, and some of them had as many as 7 burners. Egyptian dress. A mere summary of the different kinds of articles of apparel worn by the Egyptians during the long period of their history would fill a good-sized volume, and in a little book like the present, only a few of the most important of them can be mentioned. The primitive waistcord, with its knot of magical significance. We see the Mazda-Yesnahe, Zarathustra culture with that, but we also see the predating Yazidi culture with that sort of thing. And that, of course, will need more argument, but to the antiquity of the Yazidi culture, but became a belt or girdle made of costly linen. The loincloth made of linen became a tunic of an elaborate form, and under the influence of the wealth derived from the conquered or raided nations, the Egyptians attained to a height of luxury in dress which is still hard to understand and harder still to describe. It was not modesty or shamefacedness that drove them to multiply the size and number of their garments, but love of display and of personal adornment. The naked human body at no time troubled them. Boys and girls went about naked, the former even whilst they were at school, and by boys and girls they mean pre-adolescents. Men and women worked in the fields naked. Servants of both sexes went about their work in the house and around naked, and women of the upper classes were not ashamed to leave their necks and breasts uncovered before the public gaze. Now, shame, well, they certainly didn't have body issues, but they certainly got past any guilt or shame, because guilt and shame are two different things. The bas-reliefs and paintings of the New Kingdom show that about 1400 BCE, women loved to have their longest garments made of diaphanos materials, through which every part of their bodies could be seen, and noblemen sat at meat and took part in religious festivals, with the upper half of their bodies and legs bare. The dress of entities considered to be gods and the king had much in common.